Hello everyone. Welcome to our meeting of the California Phenomenology Circle. Today, our speaker is Mike Shim, who's professor of philosophy at Cal State LA. He did his PhD at Stony Brook. He works on Husserl phenomenology, philosophy of mind, and history of modern philosophy. His paper for us today is called, he's changed the title, I guess, since the beginning. It's called Wordless Cognition: How Anendophasiacs Think. And first, I guess, Mike, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, anendophasiac. It's a new word.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know what it is, but I might be having some connectivity issues. So if I freeze or something like this, if you can let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm just gonna do the presentation. Everyone can see this, okay? Yeah. Okay. So we'll. Okay. So I'm going to talk about representation indirectly, but that original title was vague enough, and this is what I'm going to talk about today: is wordless cognition, how anendophasiacs think, and then I'll explain what an anendophasiac is. It's a kind of a recent phenomenon. So I'm going to start with a joke, and the joke goes: the psychiatrist asks whether you ever hear a voice inside your head. After staring back at her quizzically, you reply, "Of course. How else do you think?" So the rest of the paper is really just like a punchline to this joke. So here's some theses that I introduce. So my theses should cohere with the views of the early Husserl. So this is some timestamp, like around this period. We could talk about why I chose this period as the early Husserl, but my thesis should cohere with the views of the early Husserl. And as far as the early Husserl goes, my theses, my exegetical theses, should be pretty familiar and otherwise orthodox. So the first thesis is that cognitive phenomenology is independent of linguistic phenomenon. That's the first thesis. So let me clarify. If there is something that it's like to think, if there is such a thing as cognitive phenomenal qualia, then its occurrence does not imply the concurrence with some linguistic sensation, the sensory features of any linguistic expression. So what it's like to see the words or the gestures of American Sign Language, hear speech, or feel the haptic feedback of Braille, etc. These would be examples of linguistic sensations, or I call them linguistic phenomena. First disambiguation is that the discipline of phenomenology, just by definition, of course, does imply the use of linguistic expressions. And that just has to do with some ambiguity about how the phrase cognitive phenomenology gets used. So what this means is that what it's like to think need not imply any sensory experience of language. So for instance, to think that the earth is flat should not require the articulation, whether publicly overt or privately subvocal, of the words "the earth is flat." Husserl's main argument for this thesis is that what he calls wordless cognition exists. So wordless cognition is not just so-called tip of the tongue phenomenon and the like, but also the experience of non-linguistic objects. So the quote here is, to whether meaning intention can be divorced from all expressions, Husserl replies unambiguously, quote, that this question must be answered affirmatively is shown by cases of wordless cognition, which exhibit the precise character of verbal recognition, although words and their sensuous signative content are not actually present at all. So that's the main argument he uses, or the main premise of the argument. So the second thesis is that the above thesis is a necessary premise of Husserl's argument for conceptualism, which is the view that perceptual experience bears conceptual content. So if the above thesis is false, either only the perception of linguistic phenomena counts as cognitive, or perceptual cognition always involves an additional linguistic experience, for example, subtitle like symbolic representation, which he talks about sometimes. Or, of course, conceptualism is false, and conceptualism is a minority philosophical position. So I take it that most people actually think that conceptualism is false, but I'm going to assume that at least exegetically conceptualism is true about Husserl. I leave open-ended whether some sensory experience, linguistic or not, is necessary for cognitive phenomenology. I'll leave that open-ended. I don't know. We could talk about this, and there are some reasons for why this claim may be problematic. For even if some sensory experience is necessary for cognitive phenomenology, there is still no reason to believe that any cognitive phenomenon is reducible to that particular sensory experience. So again, I'm having some connectivity issues. If I freeze, please let me know. For instance, we can insist on both the numerical identity of cognitive phenomenal content C, so for example, instantiation of some particular proposition, and the recalcitrant diversity of the sensory contents that can accompany it. And finally, I close with the conjecture. So the assumption is that the perceptual experience of linguistic phenomenon must be on all fours with the phenomenology of perceptual experiences in general. Even if some sensory content is necessary for cognitive phenomenology, linguistic phenomenon is merely contingent. In communication, however, linguistic phenomenon is the only relevant sensory content. So any sensory content is merely contingent to perceptual experience. And this invites a kind of transcendental argument with which I will close this presentation. So those are my theses. So the first is a brief review of Husserl on inner monologue. This is Logical Investigations 1, Section 8. Communication implies linguistic perception. So in order for you to understand what is being communicated, you must hear the words or read them, Braille or American Sign Language. The converse is not the case, since you can perceive fragments of a foreign language that you do not understand. That would be an example of like a purely sensory linguistic experience as opposed to a cognitive experience. According to Husserl, what's also necessary for communication is what he calls intimation, that the speaker's verbalized expressions should indicate her intentionality, which is inferred by the auditor. Without such inference, there is no communication. However, communication is not necessary for meaningful experience of language. Husserl's argument is that since intimation is not necessary in inner monologue cannot be construed as a form of communication, even though inner monologue is meaningful and cognitive. Husserl characterizes the project of logical investigations as the phenomenology of what it's like to think, which is my liberal translation of this, Phenomenologie der Denkerlebnisse. My justification is, in general, lateness, living through or undergoing some experiences, matches what contemporary philosophers mean by qualia, or what it's like, etc. And that's then justifies my liberal translation. It should hardly be controversial then to say that Husserl was an early practitioner of what we today call cognitive phenomenology. For Husserl, does cognitive phenomenology entail inner monologue? Given Husserl's acknowledgement of wordless cognition, presumably his answer is no. So next is cognitive phenomenology and inner monologue. Now, to conduct the discipline of cognitive phenomenology, the examination of one's own inner monologue would be methodologically convenient. For instance, subvocally utter "the earth is flat." There is the linguistic sensation, which you quasi-hear. Since what you quasi-hear is detached from any external signal qua object, it's plausible to conclude that the linguistic sensation is object-independent, internal, purely phenomenal, or otherwise intrinsically mental. Since you can also subvocally utter "지구는 뿅뿅하다" without understanding it, you may claim there is an additional phenomenon, that it's like to understand the earth is flat. The separable phenomenal experience of understanding, which Husserl calls meaning intention, is the content of cognitive phenomenology. Husserl claims that this cognitive content can be constant between the earth is flat, 지구는 뿅뿅하다, and seeing or imagining this, right? These are all, you can have the same cognitive content with all these three different sensory instantiations. Despite this convenience, Husserl's acknowledgement of wordless cognition tells us that inner monologue is not necessary for cognitive phenomenology. The sensory expression of cognitive content is multiply realizable, even non-linguistically. Thus, even if some sensory phenomenon is necessary for cognitive phenomenology, cognitive phenomenon is not reducible to, explained by, or supervenient upon any particular sensory realizer. Next, I'm going to introduce anendophasia, what that is. As it turns out, not everyone enjoys inner monologue, dubbed aneuralia or anendophasia. Although there is some correlation between anendophasia and this other psychological phenomenon rather recently dubbed aphantasia, they must not be conflated. Aphantasia is the inability to entertain mental images, especially of the visual kind. Because like most psychological concepts, anendophasia is a spectral condition, some endophasiacs are capable of mental imagery otherwise, while some aphantasiacs enjoy inner monologue. It's still early days, but a couple of studies suggest the following. Aphantasia is a very rare condition affecting perhaps only 2% of the population. By contrast, anendophasia is very widespread, with some estimates up to 20% of the human population. Further, socially, behaviorally, and functionally otherwise, there is no reason to think that anendophasia is any kind of disability or even a cognitive disadvantage. So anendophasia and cognition. The question is not whether the anendophasia can communicate and think. That's not the question. It's obvious that they can communicate. And certainly, if only based on their overtly linguistic behavior, there should be no controversy over ascribing to the anendophasiac the ability to think. So that's not the question. Instead, the question is whether the anendophasiac can enjoy cognitive phenomenology. Whether the anendophasiac can enjoy what it's like to think that is distinct from any sensory phenomenology. For, if the anendophasiac can be credited with thinking while enjoying no cognitive phenomenology, then cognitive phenomena cannot be essential to thought. Since wordless cognition is acknowledged, the Husserlian can embrace the necessity of cognitive phenomenon to thought, despite the anendophasiac's lack of inner monologue. So phenomenological conceptualism, very briefly. According to Husserl, perceptual experiences are paradigmatic of wordless cognition. Since, according to his intentional essence thesis, X is an intentional act if and only if X bears both act quality and act matter, and act matter is the genuine immanent feature of the act that instantiates some conceptual content or proposition. If perceptual experience is intentional or representational, and certainly in the later Husserl, perception is paradigmatic of intentionality, then perceptual experience must bear conceptual content. So this just kind of follows from this necessary condition. Accordingly, looking at an inkpot, and this is a Husserlian example from Logical Investigation 6, looking at an inkpot, knowing what an inkpot is, and looking at it without knowing what it is, are two qualitatively different perceptual experiences. Even if you've forgotten the word inkpot, you can still represent the object as an inkpot, and that's an entailment of wordless cognition. Just so, nothing should rule out the anendophasiac from seeing the object as an inkpot without the subvocal utterance of any word. So the anendophasiac should be capable of cognitive perceptual representation. In other words, given the setup, given how Husserl sets up phenomenological conceptualism, we have no reason to think that the anendophasiac couldn't enjoy cognitive perceptual representation. Next is anendophasiac communication. So communication is a kind of perception. So what's true of perception should also be true of communication. In communication, the only relevant sensory phenomenal content is linguistic phenomenon or linguistic sensation. According to Husserl, any perceptual experience comprises the following genuinely immanent features: act quality, attitudinal modality. It's actually more than that, but for simplicity, we'll just stick with attitudinal modality. Act matter, conceptual content or propositional content, and sensations or holetic data, sensory qualia or phenomenal character of the sensory kind. By contrast, for the early Husserl, the perceived object is transcendent to the act. It's phenomenologically opaque, such that you never enjoy direct phenomenal experience of it. And this coheres with early Husserl's conjunctivism. Since sensations are genuinely immanent, while the perceived object is transcendent, we must not confuse any sensation with the property, feature, or substance of any external object. Sensations are the act-dependent means through which the act-independent object is intended. Further, as genuinely immanent, sensations are necessary or intrinsic to any perceptual experience, so I presume the early Husserl to believe. The only relevant kind of sensation in communication is linguistic phenomena. Since sensations are distinct from objective properties and the like, so must linguistic phenomena be distinct from the perceived utterances or scribbles. However, there is no reason to think that even in communication, the anendophasiac enjoys any such linguistic sensations. Since anendophasiacs can communicate as well as anyone else, but is incapable of entertaining linguistic sensations, we must deny that linguistic sensations are necessary to communication. Since communication is a kind of perception, the account of communication must be on all fours with that of perception in general. Therefore, sensations in general are not essential for perception. If that's right, what's required is an account of perception that dispenses with sensations as a necessary feature. So what I'm going to do now is I call this an off-the-shelf transcendental argument, because I'm not going to introduce what I think to be Husserl's theory. I'm going to point to like an off-the-shelf contemporary theory that's similar enough to Husserl. I'm not going to actually talk about Husserl's own positive views, because that'll actually take us to the later Husserl. So early Husserl's theory of perception is, I contend without further argument, based on his phenomenology of linguistic perception qua communication. So my view is that, especially when you're reading the first edition of the Logical Investigations, once you get to investigation 6, where he actually, investigations 5 and 6, where he actually develops more fully his theory of perception, I think it makes best sense to understand the early Husserl's theory of perception as based on or modeled on the phenomenology of communication. But I'm not going to argue for that here. We could talk about it. So when you hear someone tell you that the earth is flat, the act quality is hearing, the act matter is the proposition that the earth is flat, and the only relevant sensations involved are linguistic. The act matter enables you to interpret or animate the linguistic sensations, and that's how you understand that the earth is flat. For the early Husserl, sensations in general are intrinsic monadic features of the intentional act, categorically distinct from the object. In other words, during normal communication, the external verbal signals must be accompanied by inner monologue to complete the communicative transaction. But the anendophasiacs do not enjoy inner monologue. Nevertheless, the anendophasiac can communicate. Since the anendophasiac can perceive and understand, she can be ascribed the same act quality and act matter. What she lacks is the accompanying inner monologue. Consequently, we're looking for some theory that can accommodate the anendophasiac's communicative success. Since communication is a kind of perception, this theory must also deny the necessity of perceptual sensations in general. Off the shelf, the kind of theory that can satisfy the requirements of anendophasiac communication is a theory of perception that looks like this. Sensations distinct from the perceived features and properties of the perceived object itself are not necessary. Some people perhaps the vast majority of the population do enjoy additional sensations on top of the external features and properties. However, no matter how common, the existence of anendophasia strongly suggests that sensations are nevertheless not necessary to perceptual experiences. Such an off-the-shelf theory contradicts the early Husserl's theory of perception. I think that should be obvious. But my conjecture is that such an off-the-shelf theory coheres with the later Husserl's object-centered or noematic account of perception. And yeah, that's the presentation. I'll entertain whatever questions, of course. If you could kind of move a little, it would help me because I don't know if I'm pausing or not.
You're doing fine.
Okay.
David, please unmute and go ahead.
David, you have to unmute yourself.
I guess you didn't get any inner monologue without the button there. A whole bunch of wonderful distinctions that you've drawn. So I'm trying to, I won't be able to keep up with them, any of them, I'm sure. But I wanted to throw out a kind of example that many people will have heard, and especially as we pass the age of 60 or so. I dropped the name of someone. So let's suppose that I'm meeting Mike himself, you, at an APA meeting, and I say, oh, I've forgotten your name, but I remember we talked about Husserl's wordless cognition the other day. Well, there's an immediate recognition that it's perceptual. I don't know how that parses between the early Husserl and the late Husserl that you're referring to. But that experience is stunning to me because I always think it's as if to take the brain, the neural model of files of information or something. I can access everything I know about you from my past experience except the name. So there's a word that's missing, and yet there's a lot of cognitive content that's coming through. So can we run that kind of example perhaps through the fleet of distinctions, which I think I was with you all the way, but I can't keep it all straight at the same time.
Yeah, so I want to say that those kind of experiences, number one, Husserl recognizes as paradigmatic of perception. So clearly he doesn't think that we need like subvocal utterances or anything to exercise our cognitive abilities. So when you see me, but you can't remember my name, but you can access all these object files about me, that's cognitive, as you say, and there's no resistance in my paper to that. And what I want to say is that even the anendophasiac can experience that kind of cognitive filing without having to utter any inner monologue.
And so if you go beyond names to predicates and adjectives and adverbs and content that is cognitive in some broad sense, I'm not sure if I'm up to how everyone else is using that word anymore. I remember the earlier discussions with Galen and Strauss introducing cognitive phenomenology. But so I was wondering how the cognitive contents that we want to bring in, independently of sensory elements and certainly of any linguistic sound that we might hear or in the mind's ear, as it were. So how do you think we spread the term, the cognitive content around?
Well, I guess you could do it in like the traditional ways, like functionally or by action or but behaviorally, and thereby ascribe to the individual some kind of cognitive capacity that's being exercised. But internally, what I do worry about, like I want to be kind of neutral about whether or not there's something like pure cognitive phenomena. So whether or not, so in Husserl, what's possible is just like in perception or through imagination, you can exercise your cognitive ability with like visual images or through perceptual experiences, and that's fine. But still, that involves sensations. And I want to sort of say that, well, and I don't know that you can ever have pure cognitive phenomenon devoid of any sensations, but certainly anendophasiacs and the examples that you yourself provide of perception and so on, they seem to strongly suggest that you can have cognitive phenomenon that's independent of any particular sensation that you just so happen to randomly associate with a particular thought. So I would actually stop at that point.
Sounds good.
David had a question.
Yeah, I think this is relevant. So it seems, I think that the best theory of the best semantics for names is a metalinguistic semantics. So in order to explain what a sentence like, there are far too many Davids in philosophy means, because there are dozens of us, is that what that means is that there's far too many people named David in philosophy. What is it to be a David is to be named David. And so it seems to me that in order to think about somebody by name, so to speak, you have to have a token of the name present somehow, either externally or internally. And I guess that would mean that that anendophasiacs couldn't think about people by name, because to think about someone by name is to think about them by thinking about their name, because the meanings of names are metalinguistic. Of course, that means that, well, I think that entails a special view about names. You can't have a sound as part of a cognitive experience, but it has to be the referent of some kind of cognitive experience, the content of which is this name. But yeah, I wonder what you say about that.
Well, so I actually have a really good friend who's an anendophasiac. I went to grad school with them. So like I was saying, it's not a disability at all. And he only recently kind of has come to terms with this idea that with the way he describes it is there's like a void. There's like an absence of any kind of language when he experiences things and so on. What you would expect, right? But what he also says is that he talks to himself aloud nonstop. And so remember, I'm not precluding perceptual experiences. I'm not precluding like even talking out loud, right, as way of logging onto some kind of reference, the way we normally do with indexicals or names. So my reply is that the anendophasiacs can think about names and think about the references of the names by simply uttering it out loud, right, in place of a subvocal speech. And so my main distinction I want to draw is the one between something like sensations as a monadic, intrinsically mental property of your act, and of course, publicly available signals like talking to yourself so that you can actually hear yourself speak out loud, in which case you do have something like auto communication there. That's the way I would look at names like that.
So if anendophasiacs who aren't aphantasics, is it they can't form mental images of words?
Right, they can't form mental images of words of the oral kind and possibly of the visual kind, but they can picture things like the way you and I picture it.
Okay, so it's specifically that they can't imagine words.
Yeah, that's the way it seems like. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, Joe, do you know Jody Azuni?
No.
Well, anyway, he's a very prolific philosopher and poet, and he claims that he never subvocalizes things. And I once heard Ruth Marcus say that she never subvocalizes things either. So yeah, it is not uncommon. And Jody once told me that he realized that the reason people don't like his poetry is that he's not hearing it in his head. And that's a really important part of poetry.
But there's a kind of a background to this whether it's aphantasia or anendophasia. It's like a kind of a joke is that sometimes when philosophers disagree with one another, It may be that one of them suffering from a condition, like a psychological condition, which makes it impossible for them to understand things like sense data theory, for example, right? Or indeed like cognitive phenomenology if they assume it must involve inner monologue.
I think I saw Ron raise his hand.
I tried to, I wasn't sure whether it succeeded. I'm curious about your final point. If I understand correctly, you're saying that perception does not require any kind of holetic data?
The claim is that holetic data, no matter how common it may be and how widespread it may be, doesn't seem essential or necessary for perceptual experience.
Well, then what in the world would be the constraints on the noema perception? I could just fantasize anything I wanted to. It seems to me that holetic data are what provide a source of verification as to whether we have things right, or whether we're seeing reality as it is, or it's just a total figment of our imagination.
Oh, no. I mean, I want to say that what constrains your perceptual experience of like this water bottle are the facing surface features and properties of the water bottle, as constrained by publicly accessible facts about you, the perceiver.
That doesn't seem to me to work. If those properties are just out there in the world, independent of me. So, I mean, they're properties that the backside of the water bottle has, and they don't place any constraints on me whatsoever.
Yeah, so this may be where there's a difference in the interpretation of Husserl. So I actually kind of do think that the later Husserl his phenomenology is much oriented around properties of the object, and these properties do constrain our experiences. And it may be because our experiences are not like intrinsically internal or phenomenal or mental in nature. So that's a
Well,
possibility.
the properties of the object will help determine what sensations I am capable of having in the presence of the object.
Well,
it's
at least
those sensations that I have in the presence of the object that constrain what interpretation I can give.
There is an important, so there is in order for sensations to play the normative role that you would like it to play, it would have to be representational, right?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Yeah, you would have. So, for example, if I'm seeing, if I think that I'm looking at a ripe banana, my sensation has to be yellow-like or something like this. Otherwise, I cannot claim that report based on my experience.
Yeah,
and that's the way it's going to play that normative.
I'll go along with that.
And that's the way it would play a normative role that you need for it, right? Sensation, it has to be somehow like correct about the external object or be strongly, so one kind of sensation must be strongly correlated with an external property or something like this in order for sensations to play the normative role that you want it to play, right, Ron?
I think that's right.
Okay. But I want to say that number one, Husserl denies the intentionality of sensations and holetic data. So at face value, it seems like he denies representationalism about sensations.
Say that again. He denies what?
So at face value, it seems like he denies representationalism about sensations.
But you said he denies that intentionality requires, what did you say before that?
He denies consistently that sensations and holetic data are intentional.
That's true. They're not intentional.
So I take that to mean it's representational, and so there is no accuracy that comes up about it when it comes to external objects. And there is one quote that from the Logical Investigations, which is worth mentioning, if I could find it. No, I have it in a paper, so I should be able to find it.
Well, it's not the sensation by itself that has any kind of representational character. I mean, you provide a kind of interpretation through the noema, and then it's not that sensation had representational character, but its position in a whole series of actual and possible other sensations that determines whether it has any representational validity.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that our interpretations of the noema differ, right?
Well, that may be true, but all I think we really need at this point is that it provides the conceptual aspect of intentionality.
Yeah, I tend to think that we have the cognitive contents operating on our side, on the subject side, and the constraint about whether or not our cognition is correct or incorrect, accurate or inaccurate, is determined by facts about the object itself without any mediation by sensations. And that's how I would propose to interpret the noema in the later Husserl, which would be very different than the way you interpret it, and you and David interpreted it.
Okay, well, I'll pass on to somebody else.
David, you raised a hand.
I'm gonna
Unmute.
David.
I said, hi, David Pitt again. Great to see you again. So between Mike and David, how are we using the word cognitive or cognitive phenomenology these days? In the background of the questions just bounced around here, are there pure sensation experiences? So I think the way Ron and I have read, or following Dogfin have read the later Husserl, there's a fusion of sensory and cognitive content, if you like. And in the early Husserl, as you're working out, allows for distinctions between them. So they're just interesting different theories that are on the table here. So I'm wondering which kind of, how far the term cognitive goes in cognitive phenomenology these days, and nod to David for bringing up, after Galen and Strawson, the next big articles on the subject. So I wanted to know how broad the content is, and what I have in mind is experiences where you're picking up something extremely familiar around the household that you have no name for it. So there's an electrician over here doing some work right now. I don't know I didn't know the word drop for the connection in electrical. That's the plug on the wall. I had no idea of what you would call it, know exactly what the plug is, know how to turn different doorknobs in different ways. They have different names in their hardware store. I don't know the names for any of those, and yet I use them all the time. So is that, when is the content cognitive, and how do we separate it from the sensations as well? For you guys,
I'll let David speak. He's more the expert in this than I am.
Yeah, so what I meant by it, and I think what Galen meant by it when he first used the term in 86 was what he later calls understanding experience. And so I don't call it cognitive phenomenology anymore, because that term is being used to cover a wide range of things, like anything that's even remotely cognitive or rational, that's conscious, like belief. That's called cognitive phenomenology. And I'm kind of on the fence about whether there's a phenomenology of belief itself. So what I like to, what I do in my book, I prefer the term conceptual or propositional. So it is a phenomenology of thought. That's what I always meant by cognitive phenomenology, but nowadays it gets used for a wide range of things that I didn't intend to use it for. So I think it's what Galen later calls understanding experience or meaning experience, what I call conceptual experience or propositional experience.
The way I'm using the term is I just disambiguate between the discipline of phenomenology, because like when we talk about cognitive phenomenology and we talk about Husserl is pursuing the discipline of describing the psychological features of cognition, right? Yeah. But way the folks in general use the word phenomenology in analytic philosophy of mind seems to be more like what they mean by qualia or the character of the phenomenal experience or character of the cognitive experience or something like this.
Right. And what
And-
what we do is we use lowercase p for that and capital P
Yeah.
for the movement.
Right. But for my purposes for this paper, that wasn't a big distinction. That wasn't an important distinction. That use mentioned distinction.
Well, I have other question. No one else.
Please go ahead.
I think Mike just okay. Mike, you froze mid puff. So I was wondering if we could go back to what you present as Husserl's argument for the conceptual content of perception. Though I think I have a better idea now because he thinks that so he's not what we would call in the analytic part of the forest a kind of representationalist about phenomenology, that it doesn't, or sensory phenomenology, it doesn't represent all by itself. So if representation is only introduced by some sort of conceptual element. But I wonder.
That's exactly right, actually.
Yeah.
What you just said, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the reductive representationalists who are basically naive realists. The phenomenology's out there. And there's causal relations.
They insist they're not. They insist they're not, but yeah.
Oh, actually, yeah, there's a paper by Alex Byrne and Michael Tide that says, yep, all you ain't in the head. There's several papers by them where they're very explicit about it, and I think it's completely incoherent. But so, I mean, this is only an analogy. But it seems that there's kinds of representations that don't, I think I know what you're going to say to this. I'm going to ask it anyway. You think about the difference between like a picture and a text, right? The picture represents a scene without words. Now, I guess you could say, well, yeah, but your perception of the picture and your perception of it as representing something is going to be chock full of concepts. But I mean, what if you just had like a Ganzfeld experience of just green? And you might say, well, that doesn't represent anything. Well, or you might say it does, but then I guess you'd say it only does if you conceptualize it now. So I'm thinking out loud, and maybe I don't have a question after all, but I don't know. It's always seemed to me that there's two styles of representation. There's sort of the pictorial and the wordy stuff, and that they really are different, and that the contents of perceptual experience are much richer than the contents of concept. And like David was saying with the doorknobs and stuff, I mean, I can have experiences. Think about how complex your current visual experience is. Really, really complex. And is there really a concept for everything in your experience? Does there need to be? So can you say everything that you're perceiving? Can you describe everything that you're perceiving? And is that, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, so my response to that is, so you're correct about Husserl. Husserl says there are sensations, but they're not the stuff that represents anything, right? What represents are the beliefs, like concept, like stuff, because of their semantic properties. And my answer to like the question about the complexity and the richness and so on and so forth of perceptual experiences, the way I would account for that is to say, for Husserl, sensations are kind of like, I don't know what the word is. The word that I use is like locally phenomenal. they're not really about anything outside of you. If they're about anything at all, they're about like your brain or your body or something like this. And that would make sense why sensations in general don't represent. They're more like the effects of underlying causal transactions inside of you, sometimes with impingement from the outside world, and sometimes without, because you're hallucinating or dreaming or whatever. So that's the way I would explain sensations as non-representational. I almost want to say that sensations in Husserl are like epiphenomenal. Yeah. And not normatively really constrained, because it's not constrained by any external object or external fact of the matter. That's the way I would put it. I'm still looking for this quote, but that's the way I would respond to that. I don't know if that's a satisfactory response for you, David.
Well, so this is, of course, an empirical question, but it seems to rule out the possibility of non-conceptual creatures representing their environments in experience.
Yeah, so there is in fact a quote in the Logical Investigations where Husserl deliberately conceives of a creature like that. He says, this creature enjoys perceptual sensations as we do, but it lacks conceptual wherewithal, and consequently, it's not representing the external world at all, but only like suffering the effects of underlying causal transactions. That's the way he characterizes such creatures. That they don't represent, they don't enjoy perceptual representation. And if perception is intrinsically representational, you have to say something really weird. They suffer the perceptual sensations, but they don't perceive.
They suffer.
David
David.
Smith again.
The other David here stepping in. Yeah, these are all good examples to prime the problems here. I guess I've always thought of the more pure sensations, like feeling dizzy. Well, what's that about? It doesn't have conceptual content. So now to other David, one way of narrowing a form of cognitive cognitive experience in the case of understanding in communication, which is linguistic, which my scenarios are about. So if you have a kind of content that we only seem to process through language, then that's a different phenomenon than anything like dizziness, which would be separated. But I'm also fishing for intention, let's call it pure intentional experiences or elements or moments of experience that are intentional without sensory. So a lot of a whole variety of experiences. So one of the most fascinating forms of experience for long held an interest in is simply empathy, the very basic form that Edith Stein so nicely captured, floating around in Husserl probably, but I don't know how the scholarship is going to come out. So now I incorporate you and I see that you're looking sad. I don't need the words, especially if I'm a therapist, say, then I have a better feeling for a range of emotions and I'm sensing something about you. There may be sensory images like the look of your face, but that's not the same thing as a pure sensation. So I'm trying to fish around for more examples that are where we are, as it were, something like locally, and how do you say that, anendophasiac? So we all will have lots of experiences that are loaded with either pure sensations or sensory intentional experiences, which are more typical, seeing the red Porsche drive by or something. And then these other kind of experiences. So I'm fishing around for some more, again, along the lines of, well, what might be considered cognitive without getting into the most focal kinds of propositional contents. And one of the examples that I've used is, suppose I'm thinking that Kant founded the doctrine of transcendental idealism. Boy, that's hard to get that out in anything sensory. The only thing about sensory is the flow of the words. And then if you're starting to teach phenomenology, I would usually say, okay, let's say phenomena, got that. Now say phenomenology, got that. And then the class can start studying phenomenology with a capital P too, that things. So you have a sense for how we could begin to narrow some of these experiences which are like seeing this is one of Stein's examples, seeing the sorrow on a person's face, as you might put it. We're separating anything like a pure sensation. You're not going to experience a pure sensation in that case. You're experiencing a person who is in some kind of anguish. And yet that word is already too loaded, right? Angst, anguish in English, German, Angst differently. So in other words, what do you think about the forms of, is there a kind of cognitive element? Is there not a kind of cognitive element in specifically thinking of seeing another person experience, where you are, Stein's term is non-primordially, I see the others, I experience the other's experience. It's a little bit loaded. I non-primordially, I experience the other's experience. That's Stein's characterization of empathy. So isn't there a kind of cognitive element there, which we haven't talked about yet on the table yet? Does that help?
What does he mean by non-primordial?
Well, primordial is everyday perception, and the simpler version in the investigations is where you separate the sensations from the thinking, and then the later Husserl tends to fuse them together. And there are a lot of flavors of noema out there, so I just like to see several different theories of on the table to work with. So then primordial perception is when I immediately see the tree across the street. And let's say see it as a palm tree. We're trying to get rid of those in California, right? But it's over there. So that's one kind of immediacy in experience. And the Stein's idea is that, or theory is that, the kind of immediacy that you have in empathetic perception, I called it. Long ago, I wrote a book, The Circle of Acquaintance, about all this stuff. Starting interestingly with the indexical terms themselves, which are words, but immediately you're beyond the cognitive and into the indicative mode, as it were, getting at something. I don't see how representation, the word, captures the different phenomena altogether. So that's what I had in mind. Stein's version, she's original. The German is originär, I believe. So it's just like originating, and non-primordial is not originating the experience of sorrow that I see in my friend's face. So non-primordial, it's a bit deferred in a particular way. Is that not still cognitive without words even? And without
Yes.
propositional content? It's intriguing phenomenon. It's 1989 was the book. I don't know how many people know it yet.
So I think in logical investigations, I guess an example of empathy is what he calls intimation. So when the example of like David Smith speaking right now, and I am inferring his thought contents based on his verbalization. So if that is cognitive, and that seems to me cognitive, it seems to be inferential. And if we were to generalize to empathy in general, we would say, yeah, empathy, even when it's involving behavior that's nonverbal, involves inference of what you expect that person's internal state to be like. And so that would be a cognitive process, I imagine.
And the inference part would reflect what Ron was bringing in from the horizon structure. So we can all parse those key concepts in different ways and get different interesting theories. So yeah, I hadn't thought about that sense of intimation as exactly what Stein had in mind, but I'll think about that. I think that's a cool idea to think about.
And I think with primordial and non-primordial, David, you do mean founded and not and founding modes, right?
No, the term is originary and non-originary. So it's not a very helpful term. Primordial is beautiful sounding, and non-primordial is not quite as beautiful as direct perception. But that's about as much as you get out of the terms, I think. So intimation is interesting to bring in. Also, the thing is, the horizon structure is around from probably before the investigations too, scholarly, but different forms of what will later become horizon structure are definitely around the corner. And that's part of the cognitive. So I immediately experience I experience something of what the other person is experiencing. And then we can go on and talk about it if we're talking about therapy situation, for example, or just a friendly situation. What's been bothering you today, Mike? Well, it's this and that. Another question, since beautiful, you used the Chinese formulation and the English
Korean.
Latinate form. So if you're bilingual,
Korean, wasn't it Korean?
It was Korean, yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, yeah.
It was Korean, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would keep asking my students to last two dissertations were both Korean Americans or Korean Canadian, Korean Americans. And I always wonder where the different languages parse for exactly these issues, because when the symbols are so different, and what is syntax in the Korean?
I might have something that I could. Oh, so let me just kind of share this part.
They're definitely cognitive, but the linguistic can't fit the way we think about syntax in our well-defined contemporary logic, right? So back to you, Mike.
So, I mean, I don't know if this helps, but hopefully it'll help a little bit. So I did this in an early note. So tree and the pronunciation, and Baum in German, and the concept is the same. Namu in Korean, the concept is the same. Japanese, giit, tree. And then at this point, you basically just imagine or see an actual tree. But if you look at the progression here, this looks nothing like a tree. This looks nothing like a tree. Korean looks nothing like a tree. But then once you get to the Japanese, it actually kind of looks like a tree. And then you could see this kind of a surface similarity between the last two images, right? Yeah. So the point of that is just an argument for conceptualism. So I would use that set of examples as an argument for that perceptual experiences can bear conceptual contents. Because if you can look at 4 totally different images and have the same thought, right, then there must be some kind of constancy in cognitive phenomenology independent of their sensory realizers, which is what I meant by recalcitrant diversity of sensory realizers, right?
That's cool. I get that.
Yeah.
One of my initial lessons from one of the students was the character, I think this is Chinese though, between a tree and a forest. And it was just 1 and 2 of the symbols of the shapes there.
Yeah, yeah.
But one nice thing about this example as a intercultural phenomenon is that we've all been around trees of various kinds. And yet we've got something we're trying to share in the different languages. So, okay, that's a window on another, trying to circle out different kinds of content that are much wider ranging. And I think of horizontal intimation meanings, semantic networks you could talk about as a little fancier version today, I guess, with large language models and so on. So that's cool. Helps to focus in on cognitive content may be cognitive in a whole bunch of different and very interesting ways. So,
but that example also is kind of a response to something that David Pitt raised earlier on about strict difference in kind between non-linguistic sensations and linguistically structured sensations.
yeah.
But examples like that kind of maybe show there's a gradation or something like this rather than a strict distinction or categorical distinction.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
Jeff Ogle had a question.
Yeah, in one way, this is a little far afield, but it does have something to do with what you were saying about highlighted data, Mike. So we were talking a little bit about seeing a sad face and what exactly that involves and how it's non-primordial. And I've thought a lot about Edith Stein, and I was sort of working on her when I was initially working on my dissertation. I didn't really do much with her in my dissertation, but anyway, I think Edith Stein, I don't know if you know the distinction between theory and simulation theory in the theory of mind. So I would connect Edith Stein to simulation theory. I think that's the right way to do it. So I think, and maybe David disagrees, but he'll let us know. You look at a sad face and there's a pairing that happens, and that's a term in Cartesian meditations, by the way. So you look at the sad face and you pair, and I think somewhere in your processes, you're simulating the sad face, and then that causes you to simulate the sensation internally that goes along with the sad face. And so now you're having the sensation of sadness, and this is all conceptually structured by the larger perceptual context in which it's occurring, so that that face over there is sad because of the conceptual structuring of it. So maybe that's a little far afield, but I think that's really interesting. Okay.
That's not, I mean, what was that, the complete question, or did you have a separate question, or?
Oh gosh, I think that was it.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
So one little hesitation I had, because I want to agree with David Smith that empathy is inferential, and so it can be, so we could talk about intimation from the logical investigations in lieu of empathy. So I kind of want to agree there, but I may be mistaken, but I believe in the Cartesian meditations, Husserl says that empathy is not inferential, and which might support your alternative way of looking at it, right? And in which case the analogy with intimation, which is clearly inferential and cognitive, therefore, may actually fall apart.
I
But
think
that
that's a nice distinction, exactly. And Ron McIntyre has a great paper from a while ago on precisely the Cartesian meditations. The notion of pairing is entirely suggestive, but I like to think that these folks are just beginning to get a handle on how to distinguish and define empathy itself. The word is only introduced as a translation of Einfühlung from it had its own background, and other people will know.
There's a barbaric translation by Anthony Steinbach. Rather than empathy, he calls it intropathy.
Oh, sure.
Actually, yeah, which is terminologically closer to the original because it has the intro in there. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a little much, but actually there probably are a whole range. You're already gesturing to a range of experiences with more or less sensory, more or less cognitive, and more or less inferential, or more or less by association is again a notion not technically different from inference. And somehow the pairing fuses my experience and the other's experience in part to a degree and so on. So I think that's very useful because I'm again trying to hear different theories or models that we have going and what's out there. I don't want to get into the criticisms of what empathy is today. DEI, now we're in trouble. Anyway, joke there, but Ron had written about the pairing in structure out of cognitive meditation, so that's cool to bring it in. I hadn't thought of it as related to linguistic intimation, so that's cool. That's very helpful. Don't mean to be talking too much here.
Yeah, I mean, the bleeding between cognition and perception, as you put it, yeah, that's something to be wary of, I would say. Yeah, because if we look at what he means by passive synthesis, you guys remember passive synthesis? If you're a Kantian, that will be an oxymoronic phrase, passive synthesis, right? Yeah, because synthesis is a spontaneous activity, that's necessarily active. But
that would fit the non-primordial, non-originary notion. It's still spontaneous, except as I remember, I could never figure out what spontaneous meant when Sartre refers to Kant, and so there's two versions of spontaneity. It doesn't sound like it's the right notion of just pops out of nowhere. No, it's rather it comes out of passive synthesis is probably another turning a corner to another way.
Oh no, but I was just talking about in what way we can talk about this kind of blurriness between cognition and perception.
Right.
Because in passive synthesis, what actually Husserl means by passivity, this is my own interpretation, it's not like a received one. But what he means by passivity to a large extent seems to be not literally passive in the Kantian sense, but something like effortless. because you've done something so many times over and over again, it's become so habitual that at some point it ceases to seem like you're making an effort. So if we associate cognition with activity, but then if you repeat this cognitive activity over and over again to such an extent that it's no longer seems to require a palpable effort, at that point we can then talk about passivity, right? But here then the word passivity, which we normally associate with perception rather than cognition, turns out to be a function of repetition and habitual formation and accrual of habits over time. And that seems to kind of point in the later host rule, point to this blurriness, this fuzziness between cognition and perception. But
And we can pick up that distinction in Merleau-Ponty and run with that for a long time too. That's good.
And there's Ron, I think, has a kind of.
Yeah, I'd like to see if I can clarify a little bit the connection between passive and active synthesis and this discussion of pairing, and also of whether there's inference involved in empathy. When Husserl says that seeing another person as a person in an act of empathy, that does not involve inference. What he means is that it is a case of passive synthesis. In pairing, for example, pairing is when you actually see two objects, but you see them both together in one act. So there's a synthesis there. It's like seeing a pair of gloves. When you see the one glove without the other one, you still see it as one of a pair. And that's based on perceptual similarities between them, but you can see the two as just distinct things, but you can pair them. So in the pairing, you don't see the one and see the other and see the similarities and infer that they have something in common. You just have this one act in which you see these two things as a pair. Similarly, in the case of empathy, I see the person, the expressions on their face and so on. I don't have a perceptual act, and then I add on to that an act of inferring, where I infer that this facial expression is caused by some inner feelings that they have. It's rather that seeing this face is the occasion for my seeing the person's sadness. So there's it's not primordial, but the step from what's immediately given to the more complex is not an active case of inference. It's a specific act of its own kind, which is called empathy.
Yeah, my only point was that you can have inferences which are so effortless that they seem passive, and
that's exactly right.
Doesn't seem cognitive, but then it is cognitive for Husserl. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. I think David Pitt had a question.
Yeah. So I think you just partially answered it. So the about passivity. So you it's a bit of advice from jazz musicians is yeah, you practice your scales and you learn your music theory, but then when you get up on the bandstand, you forget all that shit and play. And if you put in the training, it just kind of happens.
Yeah.
And I was also reminded of Mr. Stravinsky said, "I am the vessel into which the rite of spring was." But he wrote it, right? So there's still a sense in which, like the jazz musician who's not really thinking about what they're doing, and it's just it's just coming out. It's not like they're not doing anything. It's not like they're not acting on their instrument, right? So, I mean, maybe there's a sense in which they're kind of intellectually passive because they're not making an effort, but they are still acting, right? It just feels like it's happening automatically. So it
Yeah,
doesn't.
yeah.
It does. So it's effortless.
Yeah, but when it comes to thought, we can, I think, say something similar, like you have the same thoughts over and over again, or make the same associations in your head. And then in the beginning, maybe it was like a deliberate, active effort on your part, but through repetition over time, it becomes so effortless that it seems passive. So when we identify perception as a passive experience in this sense, you're not denying cognition to perceptual activity. That's the only point, right?
Okay.
Because like, for example, let's say you're European, you go to the American supermarket for the first time and you buy a carton of eggs, right? And then you go home and you open it, it doesn't look right because you're accustomed to buying 10 eggs at a time and not a dozen eggs, right? So you have to count them. And of course, in the beginning, it's like a deliberate process. Like, oh yeah, 6 and 6 is 12 rather than 10 like I thought. But then after a while, you go to the supermarket and you expect to get 12 eggs rather than 10 eggs just through repetition and habit, right? It's like that, I think.
Is that true? They sell 10 at a time in Europe?
I think so, yeah.
I never bought eggs in Europe.
Yeah, I remember that. It's like, hey, but then it's kind of weird that we sell them by the dozen. It's so bizarre.
No, it's not. It's weird to sell them by tens.
One argument for not selling by tens is because how do you get half a carton? Any other questions from?
It's the habits of the English pound system rather than the rational decimal system. Although the decimal just happens to go with 2 hands. Oh well, talk about habits, right?
Any more questions for Mike? We're at 1 hour and 15 actually.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming and listening to my talk.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, is this a paper?
I've been writing a book for years now, and this is like part of chapter 2. So I'm up to chapter
I'd love to
2
read it.
years. And once I'm done with that, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. Great. So right, Ron and David, I just wanted to mention to you briefly that I on many occasions talked about I don't know if you remember, I gave a talk at Northridge a long time ago, and I proceeded to give I said, okay, I'm going to start by giving an argument for cognitive phenomenology. I remember 2 of you sitting in the back of me, your heads are going like, no, you don't have to give an argument for this. It's obviously true. And I've mentioned that many times. And most recently, I didn't mention you by name, but I was responding to critics for a symposium on my book. And I brought that up. I said, yeah, we think it needs an argument, but some postal friends of mine think that you don't have to argue for this. Don't waste your time arguing.
Experience.
Right.
That's good. Just a new book, David.
Yeah.
I read it.
It came out last March, and there's a free PDF of it on Phil Papers. It's Oxford. It's called The Quality of Thought.
Good.
And it's all about me reinventing Husserl.
Okay, cool.
Well, the early Husserl.
Early Husserl.
I'll order it as soon as we hang up.
Okay.
Bunch of issues. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks,
thank
Mike.
you guys.
Great
Thank
talk.
you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Recording here.
I think